Right. Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar celebrating the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme Turning 2. I'm Sasha Smith, Communications Manager at GemServe, which is the delivery partner for HNES. So I'll cover some quick housekeeping points. Please mute your microphones to limit disruption. If you're not speaking, please keep your cameras off to improve the video quality. We also have a Q&A function if you'd like to ask any questions during the webinar, which you can find in the top right-hand corner. We'll try to answer any questions throughout the session and have a Q&A session at the end as well. This webinar is being recorded and then we'll distribute the slides afterwards. So we have a brilliant lineup of speakers today. We're delighted to be joined by two successful HNES projects, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, and our programme team from GemServe will also be presenting. Alex from DESNES will provide an overview of the heat networks landscape. Our HNES programme manager from GemServe, Louise Singleton, will cover a bit about HNES, the impact of the scheme that the scheme is having and its future. We'll then hear from two funded projects, the first being Hull Royal Infirmary District Heating Network from Mark Beaumont, and second we'll hear from Church Lane project from Greg Folder at Southern Housing. And then if you haven't already applied, Katie Ansari, our HNES Relationship Manager at GemServe, will explain how you can benefit from funding, and then we'll end the session with a Q&A. Great, thank you. And then so I'll hand over to Alex.
Hi, thanks, Sasha. Afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Fantastic. That's a great start. So hi, everyone. Great there's so many people joining for the webinar. My name's Alex Trubovich, and I'm the head of capital schemes for heat networks at the department. So I manage delivery of the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme and the Green Heat Network Fund. As Sasha's trailed, this is the latest in a series of events that GemServe have hosted, where we can hear direct from projects funded through the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, which for me is always a chance to kind of reflect on successes to date, but also to look forward to areas of how the scheme may evolve going forward and how we might do more to celebrate projects in this part of our sector. I thought it'd be useful just to frame this intro with a kind of a potted history of the department's support for existing networks, and then touch very briefly on what the future might hold. So going initially way back to 2018, the trigger for a lot of the work that we as a department have done in that time was the Competition and Markets Authority report on heat networks, which clearly outlined that some heat network projects deliver outcomes to consumers that are really quite poor and actually quite below the equivalent standards for individual gas and electric heating systems. And that really framed quite clearly the challenge of addressing the performance of those types of networks. Our first kind of step was in 2020 when we ran a program called the Heat Network Optimization Opportunities, and we worked with 21 existing heat network projects to start to really build an evidence base for common issues, solutions, and cost effectiveness of solutions for support for those kinds of projects. And this was really helpful in testing what would eventually become our HNES optimization study scope. In 2021 and 2022, we took that a step further and launched the HNES demonstrator. So this was a one-year scheme which included our first foray into capital support for existing networks. And it's fair to say that at that time, the scheme design focus really was primarily on efficiency, technical and operational efficiency. But during the delivery of that scheme, came at a time when the cost of energy pressures really hit, and that impacted, of course, both customers and operators. And that's obviously really informed our current scheme and our current position. In 2023, we launched this iteration of the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, which was substantially increasing our support 4 projects that were performing poorly, and really bringing forward that focus on the customer element of those projects and helping address areas of detriment. We're currently in our 8th funding round, with capital support allocated to about 80 projects to date, and revenue grant support to about 200 projects to date. So the take-up's been fantastic. Alongside that, we've also published some guidance for operators on completing optimization study works, and commissioned some videos, which we've also published, which set out the practical steps for operators that they can take to improve networks based on a kind of a whole host of common issues we see regularly through the work we fund. During this scheme lifetime, we obviously also had a change of government, and we now have a Minister for Energy Consumers, Miata Fambula, which I think reflects the kind of continuing importance of HNES in underpinning our wider policy and new build heat network development work. So as I touched on, we've been really pleased with the market response to all these initiatives we've been putting forward, and this funding support we've allocated. And this has really helped support our strategic rationale of from the department's perspective, there being a clear business need to do more in this space. And more recently, it's been really pleasing to see increasing levels of ambition in the projects that come forward for funding, both in terms of the scale of the works being put forward at individual project level, but also the kind of more strategic or portfolio approach that we see organisations taking in terms of really drilling into all the networks in their portfolios, and having a strategic approach to tackling the poorest performing first. So long may that continue. As we go through 2025 and beyond, we're beginning to move towards a sector where regulation will come into effect, with standards and performance levels for heat networks, both new and existing, pushed ever higher. Our heat network technical assurance scheme will be one of the key mechanisms for doing this for new and existing networks. And HNES has hopefully had a role in demonstrating to applicants and projects and hopefully customers as well, the art of the possible, and what can be achieved to really turn projects round from poor performing to really very well performing. And I think for this audience, it's increasingly likely that going forward we'll see much closer alignment of HNES with the technical assurance scheme requirements, and that could be in the form of aligning deliverables like optimization study outputs, testing how funding applications reflect meeting performance KPIs as defined by HNTAS, and increasing focus on addressing poorest performing, and more broadly discussing and implementing ways in which we can share aggregated HNES scheme level data more widely. So that's all to come. For today's webinar, it's really exciting to be hearing from funded projects, real tangible applicants and projects on their challenges, their successes, and hopefully the positive impacts that the work they're doing has had. And yeah, hope everyone takes something valuable away from the session, and really look forward to hearing more from the case studies we've got. So I'll leave it there. Thanks again, everyone, for attending, and hand back to you, Gemsev.
Great, thank you, Alex. I'll let Louise cover HNES overview, success, and its future.
Thanks, Sasha, and yeah, thanks, Alex, for setting the scene. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the scheme so far, in terms of what we've funded, and also a little bit of a look to the future, as Alex has already touched on. So if we go to the first slide, I'm sure many of you that have been involved with HNES to date will be familiar with the aims of the scheme, but I just wanted to cover them off again just to be clear. So we have 3 main aims. The first is to reduce carbon emissions by making heat networks more efficient. So clearly we want to make sure we're helping to meet our net zero targets. If we can improve the efficiency of heat networks, then it means that we're using less energy to heat people's homes, and therefore obviously the associated carbon emissions with that. So that's definitely one thing we're keen to support. As Alex touched on in the introduction, obviously with the cost of living crisis and energy prices rising, we're really keen to make sure that customers aren't experiencing detriment from a cost perspective, and from the fact that their heat networks aren't operating as efficiently as they could do, and they're essentially paying for waste heat. But again, tying into the Committee on Climate Change report, and the fact that we will need to increase the number of heat networks in the country to hit our net zero targets, we really want to make sure that those customers that are on heat networks already are having a really good experience, and that they're then become advocates of heat networks and really help to encourage others to see the benefits that they can bring. And then obviously the third part again is around the sector regulation and technical standards that are coming down the line. So helping heat networks to improve now ahead of the regulations, and obviously that's a major role that HNES can play. So on the next slide. So what have we achieved so far? So to date, we've announced the projects that have been funded up until round 6. We are shortly hoping to announce the outcomes of round 7, and we're finalising the outcomes of the round 8 assessments currently. So there are more projects and more announcements to come, but in terms of up to round 6, we funded 233 projects across both capital funding and revenue funding, and have awarded just shy of £35 million. There's over 43,000 residents are benefiting from these projects, and in terms of carbon savings, over the sort of 40 years that these savings are expected to last for, that's the equivalent of over 36,000 flights to London and New York. So quite a significant amount of carbon saved there. You can see in the graph on the right where the sort of funding has gone to in terms of sectors. So significant number of housing associations have been successful in receiving funding. We have then obviously got private sector, so that would include resident associations, and then local authorities as well. Obviously, we have also then got health and education. So we spoke earlier about the fact that we're really keen to support projects that support what we class as customers in need. So those on low incomes, or that really would be struggling with their energy bills, particularly if they're unreasonably high because they're inefficient. But we do also fund projects in we've funded NHS trusts. Obviously you're going to hear from one later, and also education, mainly universities, but also some school sites as well. So quite a range of organisations that have received funding through the scheme. We go to the next slide. So the split across the revenue and capital projects. So revenue projects are for heat network operators to get a consultant to come in and analyse how the network is performing currently, and identify areas of improvement and efficiencies, and essentially provide a report outcome showing what measures would be recommended to improve the efficiency and the kind of associated costs and payback periods with those measures. So 176 projects have been funded to date, just shy of 3.5 million awarded for those studies. And obviously some of those studies have then gone on to submit capital applications. So that's actually to implement the measures and make the efficiency improvements to the network. So we've currently got 57 funded projects, and again just over £31 million awarded to those projects to really make those improvements to their networks. And again later on you'll hear from one of our projects that's gone through the revenue process and then been successful in capital as well. If we go to the next slide, so the scheme is open to heat networks in England and Wales, and we've got a good spread of applications from or funded projects across the country, which is nice to see. Some of the examples of the type of works that we can fund from a capital perspective. So upgrading or replacing pipe work, improving insulation, both within the energy centre and within the primary and secondary networks. Updating controls, so making sure things are operating properly. So for example, BMS controls. Replacing HIUs. We do also do recommissioning of HIUs, so it's not necessarily just replacing them, but yeah, looking at whether we can improve the ones that are already there. Improving water quality. So this is sometimes one that gets a bit overlooked, but obviously if you've got poor water quality, that can really cause issues with things like pumps or getting things jammed or causing corrosion and stuff. So it's really important to make sure you have good water quality, and then reducing leaks. Obviously that just means that if water's leaking out, then obviously you've got to do more pumping, and it's obviously not a particularly efficient way of running a network. So those are some of the kind of types of things that we have funded. If you're interested in seeing more examples of the sort of funded measures that we can cover, we can put a link to our guidance document in the chats, and that will give you a broader list of the sort of types of measures we can fund. We go to the next slide. So there's a link at the bottom here to our website, which has got all of our press releases on. So again, we'll share the slides after the session. But every funding round, we have issued a press release, so you can see some of the examples of the projects that we have funded, and it gives a little bit of a blurb about the type of measures that have been funded, particularly for the capital projects. So if you are interested in finding out a bit more about the projects that we've funded, I'd recommend looking at those press releases. But for round 6, we've awarded £2.7 million to 33 different heat networks, which is set to benefit just shy of 2,000 residents. And there's just a few sort of photos and examples of some of the projects that we've funded. Like I say, we're hoping to issue our round 7 press release shortly. So again, there'll be more projects to look at and see what sort of measures we've been funding. If we go to the next slide. So I just wanted to touch on briefly the future of HNES. So we do have funding available out to March 2028. Our next funding round closes on the 28th of March. So if you are interested in applying, then please reach out to us. I think Katie will touch on that a little bit later. We do have future funding rounds planned as well. Round 9 is not the last one. We just haven't announced the dates of those yet. So if you're interested in looking beyond round 9, I'd recommend signing up to our mailing list. And as soon as we announce the dates, then they will be shared with those people on the mailing list. Again, we've got details of how to join that later on. And as Alex touched on in his speech, there is upcoming technical standards coming down the line. So HNES has a real role to play in supporting organisations to meet those standards and those requirements. So we definitely see, and as Alex has obviously touched on, the department sees the value in HNES in supporting organisations to meet those targets as well where necessary. So yeah, there's a bright future for HNES ahead, but it's always good to look back as well and see what we've achieved to date. So I think that's my last slide, and we can hand over to hearing about some of our funded projects.
Thank you very much. So yeah, my name's Mark Beaumont. I'm Head of Sustainability at Hull University Teaching Hospitals NHS Trust, and we're just going to take you through our project that we've completed recently, just back in December last year. So can we do the next slide, please? So we're a large acute teaching hospital based in the Hull and East Riding area. We've got 2 main large sites and provide services to around 1.25 million people. You can see there that's our Hull Royal site, you can see we have a couple of high-rise buildings, including the tower block there, which is 13 stories. If we move on to the next slide, please. This is an aerial view just to give people an idea of the size and scale of that particular site. It is our urban hospital. We're very close to the centre of the city of Hull. Our other site, if we could go to our next slide, please, is very different. This is it's a much more rural type hospital site, much more low-rise buildings. We don't have anything above 3 stories and much more spread out. So the heat network on the Castle Hill Hospital is much larger. Oh, you just go back one. I think someone was having an issue seeing slides. Karen, to give an idea of energy consumption, across the 2 sites, we consume around 30 million kilowatt hours of electricity and around 110 million kilowatt hours of gas annually. We do have 2 large CHPs, one on each site, which contribute significantly to that gas consumption. So yeah, if we could move to the next slide, please. So some bits I wanted to touch on was just some really positive things around the process of applying through the heat network scheme. We found that the application process was really positive. The fact that we could have access to a relationship manager to ask questions and help support us in the development of an application was really helpful. And the application form, compared to some other routes of funding that we've accessed previously, was much more straightforward and easy to complete. So there's some real positives there. And we just found that GemServe were really helpful throughout the process, both beforehand, during, and then when we've got into the reporting phase as well, when we've had queries or questions. So it's been a really positive experience from that point of view. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So we put in 2 bids. We have steam raising boilers on both of our sites, which distribute steam around our sites to the end users, whereby we then have plate heat exchangers to distribute the hot water around the individual buildings. A lot of our site had very old insulation. Some of that insulation was more than 50 years old. And we need to also include new heat metering so we could better account for where energy was being used around our estates. We can move to the next slide, please. Again, just to give you some ideas of the cost of the bids, that was thank you. They were the 2 bids that we put in. So in total, we were looking at originally spending just over £500,000 on upgrading the insulation around the 2 sites. Next one, please. So some examples of what some of our insulation and pipework systems look like prior to starting the work. So we did some initial investigations on the network. A lot of the network being underground services meant it's difficult to get access to inspect all of the locations. But these were some of the access areas we could get to. If we move to the next slide, please. We can see during the replacement and some of the issues that we found. So there's a number of those you can see just on the image to the left there, near the top of the image. What used to be a supporting bracket that has rusted and failed, and the pipework is now laid at the bottom of the trench. And then again on the right-hand side image, you can see an old bracket in the background, and just near the bottom of the image, you can just see a line of rust, which is the remains of what a bracket once was. So what we found was a lot of the pipework had collapsed to the bottom of the ductwork, which had obviously also had the result of the insulation wetting out from if there was rainwater ingress into them. So we had a lot of issues around failed insulation. There was also the brackets, which we didn't realise had failed when we did our initial investigations. So that again increased to the work that was required to be able to reinstate the system. And the middle image you can see there was actually at some point the steam pipework had been installed directly in and buried in concrete. So we had to come out with an alternative route for supply of that building because it was uneconomical to dig that pipework out of concrete and then to reinstate it. So we came up with an alternative option for that site. So moving on to the next slide, please. So this is what they look like before we reinstated the covers. So new brackets installed, the pipework fully supported along its length, and with new insulation. You can just see some of the concrete slabs to the right of the right-hand side image, showing what normally covers the ductwork before the soil is reinstated over the top. Can go to the next slide, please. We've just got a few final images of some of the larger sections of distribution pipework, and again you can clearly see the concrete slabs there which cover the service ducts and show the work that's gone to. There was an awful lot of work gone to maintain and gain access to all these areas around the site, which was one of the challenges. If we can just move to the next slide, please. Although we originally got our funding in September of 2023, following then tendering the work, and then we had a number of delays to that. Some of those were things due to access delays, due to requiring road closures in a number of areas, which could only be planned in with other works that was happening on site. There were some sections of insulation where in order to remove the asbestos, there were some delays there, which again caused further slippage into the programme. But I think the biggest challenge that we found was just the condition of the pipework and infrastructure. There were certain valves we couldn't isolate systems to be able to work on them safely because the valves just couldn't be accessed to be maintained. And just the fact that working on buried services gives some real unexpected issues, which is hard to plan for if you can't get access to them to survey them. So for us, we ended up incurring additional costs that the organisation had to fund, but just something to be aware of when working with buried services. Go to the next slide, please. So in total, we installed just under 2,000 metres of pipework. Sorry, not pipework, insulation. That includes steam pipework and condensate pipework. We fitted 22 heat meters. They're just finalising being commissioned at the moment. And unfortunately, we don't have the energy savings as yet due to the fact that we only completed the project back in December 2024. So we're still collating the data from the current heating season to be able to get some indicative savings through the winter period. But from the images we have and from seeing the condition of the pipework before installation and post installation, we're fairly confident we'll be achieving the savings that we set out to from the outset. Next slide, please. And thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. If you could pass over to Greg from Southern Housing.
Thanks, Sasha. Thanks everyone for the chance to speak today. I'll be introducing the Church Elm Lane HNES funded capital works project. Quite different to the last one we saw, being a residential development, and we are quite a large southeast based social landlord. So the contents of the presentation, it's really the context behind the project, why HNES funding was needed, and a bit of analysis of the outputs of the project as well. So this is an image of the scheme here. It's located in Barking and Dagenham, has 82 dwellings. It's 100% affordable housing. So residents will typically pay around 80% of the local market rate for rent. For this tenure of housing, we're unable to recover the cost of any capital works as they're considered to be included within the rent. So we face quite a lot of cost pressures in delivering affordable heating here. The scheme was built in 2014 before CP1, which in our experience makes a huge difference on the quality of installed heat networks. The scheme is also purely residential. It is located above and adjacent to Dagenham Library, but the heat network itself just serves the 82 dwellings. Next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of an overview of the process we went through, the scheme was first identified as a candidate for further study through desktop level analysis. When we set our tariffs, we set them in-house. We typically review all the data we have available, bulk meter data, heat meter data, and gas meter data. And through some quite crude analysis, we could see that this scheme was a real good candidate for further study. Is more of a more technical insight. In March 2022, we applied for a HNES optimization study. That progressed around 10 months later into a capital works application, I believe in round 4. We were able to complete that by March the following year. And ever since, we've been in the 24-month monitoring and reporting phase, looking at the outcomes of the project in terms of kind of cost, carbon, performance, and also the residents' experience as well. Next slide, please. So just going through those steps in a bit more detail, and back to the first one, which is around the desktop analysis. So just through some quite crude analysis here, we could see that the scheme was averaging around 23% efficiency, which we've calculated just by dividing the measured consumption through the heat meters within each dwelling divided by the gas use. We haven't got a further breakdown on where those losses are, but just through that analysis, it was quite obvious that the scheme was operating very, very poorly, and could be followed up with an optimization study. Next slide, please. Just going into how that inefficiency affected cost as well in relation to the heat tariffs. So we calculate heat tariffs on a scheme by scheme basis, rather than aggregated across a number of sites. So a particularly inefficient scheme will have a particularly high tariff. Prior to the energy crisis, this was almost masked in a sense. Gas prices were quite cheap, and even with very poor efficiency, we were seeing a tariff of about 10.37 pence per kilowatt hour, including standing charges and consumption of about 2,500 kilowatt hours a year. We calculated this would give an annual heating bill of about £405. So not unaffordable for most people, and it almost served to mask some of the inefficiency of the scheme. This really became an issue during the energy crisis when the price of gas increased drastically, and the tariff went up to 32.3 pence per kilowatt hour. We calculated, based on the same level of consumption, this would result in an annual bill of about £950 per year. It quickly became incredibly unaffordable, and based on I think the running definition of fuel poverty, we were seeing quite high instances of fuel poverty at the scheme. That had a number of knock-on effects on residents' kind of health and well-being, their engagement with the heating system, with the billing agent, and a number of other issues. Next slide, please. So going into this optimization study, we were lucky enough to work with a CIBSE qualified heat network consultant. I think there are only about 100 registered in the country last time I checked the register, but we've had really great experience working with a small number of consultants, particularly at this phase of the project. The Just to give you an overview of the findings, kind of broken down by constituents, so the plant room, distribution, and within the dwellings. The plant room, the analysis confirmed the efficiency that we were seeing from our desktop analysis, so about 23 to 28%. We were seeing a delta T on the flow and return of about 4 degrees Celsius, and this meant that water was coming back into the plant room well above 60 degrees. My loose understanding of how modern boilers operate is that this wouldn't facilitate the boilers to condense, and we'd see a pretty immediate drop in efficiency, or rather we'd see quite an increase in efficiency if we were to address that delta T and get those flow temperatures down, get those return temperatures down. On the distribution, quite a common issue we see in residential heat networks is that there was very poor control over the pumps. The block pumps were operating at kind of max speed. They were not modulating according to the heat demand from dwellings. There was a permanent bypass on risers, and there was also areas of uninsulated pipework and kind of poor levels of installation as well. We saw push-fit pipework on parts of the distribution system, which may partly be related to the when the scheme was built and being before CP1. Within dwellings, we were seeing very poorly balanced radiators, inefficient heat transfer, poorly located thermostats, and a number of issues with kind of insulation and even the layout of pipework within dwellings. And it's fair to say, residents were quite unhappy. There was quite high levels of overheating, and this was really down, we think, to the inefficiency of the scheme, which the optimization study largely confirmed. Next slide, please. So moving on to the capital works program that led from the optimization study. We were awarded in the region of 175k on a 360k works program. The scope of works, again, starting from the plant room, included recommissioning the pumps and the BMS, focusing on water quality, which is something we've really listened to our consultants on around how important it is for the longevity of the system. And again, given the context of the scheme, then maximizing the asset life is really, really important for us as a housing provider, if we're to do it affordably. Regarding the distribution, we had differential pressure sensors fitted to the block pumps, which I believe was in aid of ensuring the pumps modulated their speed based on demand. We fitted new riser bypasses and re-insulated certain parts of pipework. Within dwellings, we had new HRUs, we had precessable TRVs and rebalanced radiators, and I think I've mentioned thermostats were also relocated to a more favourable position. On to the next slide, thanks. So the impact. This scheme was, or the project finished around March 2024. So we're really going off data since then, and particularly the most recent winter. So, we expect these figures to be confirmed and be able to monitor it over a longer time period. But in terms of energy and carbon performance, we're seeing the efficiency of the heat network now across this winter has been 48%, compared to 23 to 28% previously. We did set a target of 54%, and we think we will hit that in future. One issue we've had is a number of heat meters haven't been reading this winter. We haven't extrapolated that data in a lot of cases, so we think our heat use figure is lower than the real figure. And as we get better heat meter data, we're expecting that that figure will creep up alongside ongoing operational management of the heat network. We're seeing about 35% reduction in baseline gas use, which I think is in line with our expectations and really vindicates the project. By our calculations, that's around a 90-ton reduction in CO2 annually, which again, we're really happy with. In terms of tariffs and affordability for residents, we're seeing quite an immediate reduction in the tariff from 32.3 to 19.3 pence. And that's based off more or less the same gas input price. When we reprocured our gas rates just before this winter and they fell, we saw a further reduction to 12.7 pence per kilowatt hour. In terms of how that affected residents' heating bills, that initial tariff reduction, we think, led to a £325 decrease annually over the baseline, or a £490 per annum per dwelling decrease on the revised tariff. Much of the impact on residents has been anecdotal, although we are trying to think of better ways to measure that in future. But we are seeing much higher rates of customer satisfaction, far better engagement with the billing agent and with ourselves over heating related issues. We're having reports of better health and well-being, and we find these issues are very interlinked. So I suspect through other metrics, if we were to look at, for example, residents' rent accounts and other metrics of their finances, then I think we'd likely see an improvement there as well. Next slide, please. So just to summarize the project, it was 49% funded. We had a 35% decrease in gas use and a 26% increase in efficiency. We were really pleased with the value of the project. We were calculating it was an investment of about £4,500 per dwelling. Part of that is how we delivered it. I'm really proud that we delivered a lot of it in-house in terms of procuring the works and the technical specification. I know in a lot of cases there won't be the resources to do that, but in this case we think it allowed us to deliver it very efficiently, and we'd be interested in benchmarking it against other projects and maybe learning how to replicate that in future. That's the end of the presentation, but would invite any questions. No, thank you.
Great, thanks. We've also got a Q&A section at the end, so if anyone does think of any questions, either pop them in the chat or you can ask our speakers at the end. Great, okay. Katie, do you want to talk about the benefits, how to benefit from HNES funding?
Perfect, yeah. So I'll just run through onto the next slide, please. So run through how much funding is available. So in the revenue grants, you can request full funding for procurement or mobilisation of external third-party support to carry out the optimisation studies. So this is usually between £15,000 and £24,000. And the optimisation studies are there to assess the heat networks projects to identify any causes of suboptimal performance and any recommended cost intervention or improvement measures. The funding also covers the final optimisation report that you'll get at the end of the study and the techno-economic analysis, which does help to have a better understanding for what measures you need to put forward. We do also encourage, should I say, if you have had a revenue grant, to apply for a capital grant in future rounds once you've got all the information you need, so these measures can be put in place. Back to the revenue funding, so up to £2 million of funding was provided across the financial years of 23-24 and 24-25. There is further funding anticipated for 25-26 and 26-27. And as I was saying before, with the capital funding, it is to put into motion of any eligible HNES measures provided. So that's something to consider. For the capital grants, it is partial funding, so it goes up to, but not including 50% of the project total. And it's available for the delivery and the installation of eligible intervention or improvement measures. The amount for this that is available is up to 75 million across the financial years 23-24 to financial years 27-28. So it's all in that time period. I would also say that the capital projects can apply for funding in the financial year 25-26 and 26-27 in the round 9 that's coming up. Revenue projects can only apply for funding in the financial year 25-26. However, the financial year 25-26 is subject to availability. Please note as well that the grant funding must be spent within its allocated financial year. So do take that into account when you are applying and filling out the application form. But match funding does not need to be spent at the same time as the grant funding. So if you do believe that your project is going to take a bit longer, especially in capital, you can spend the match funding in later years as well. Onto the next slide, please. So in terms of who can apply, it's any operators of existing district heat networks or communal heat networks or heating systems, sorry, and heat networks that are situated in England or Wales only at the moment. This includes the public sector, private sector or third sector organisations and legal entities, so with the authority to sign off in the investment decisions of the heat network they're responsible for example, like management companies and things like that. Thank you. And so the funding round closing dates for round 9, the last day to request a SharePoint space. So the SharePoint space is there for you to upload your application form, any supporting evidence and documentation that you think will aid your application. So you will need that space to apply. So the last day to request a SharePoint space is the 21st of March, and the closing date for the applications for round 9 is the 28th of March. So you can email in to ask us for either an application pack if you don't have one already, and also the SharePoint space, but it does give you a bit of time to get that information ready and let us set up the spaces for you as well. Round 10, it has been confirmed, but we don't have dates for that at the moment, so that's just to be confirmed. So if you're on our mailing list, we do often put any updates on there, or you can email in and request as soon as we find out any information for that. If you already have an application pack, please check the versions, because the application forms being used for round 9 are the version 8 for capital applications and version 6 for revenue applications. This is quite important because some of the data and questions asked in the application forms change over the rounds. So if you do end up submitting a previous version, you'll be asked to resubmit. You can also find the guidance for applicants document and the link provided in the presentation, which is definitely worthwhile giving it a bit of a read. And then where to find any help and support. So you can email in at hnes@gemserve.com for any general inquiries, or, as I said before, to request application forms and SharePoint spaces. You can also email in at hnes@gemserve.com to arrange to have a talk with relationship managers such as myself or one of the team, and to sort of run through the application process with you if you're still unsure. Please do read the guidance document, because it does provide a lot of information for you, and it can give you a better understanding of how the process actually works. And And if you haven't already signed up to our mailing list, you can in the link provided on this slide, just so you can keep up to date with any future rounds or any updates that we might need to share. There is the optimization guide provided by HNES as well in this slide, and there is some guidance videos as well, which show any helpful tips on how to improve your heat network. And then in the team, there's myself, Louise, Alison and Roisin. So if you do reach out to us, you'll probably have a response from one of us. I think that's about it. If there's any questions from anyone, we'll look in the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Katie. Yeah, so we've got plenty of time for questions. So if people would like to either raise their hand or add questions to the chat. So we've got a few in at the moment. So we've got one for Mark from Tom. So, hi Mark, as part of the study, did you look at reducing the operating temperatures in the buildings and moving away from a steam system to a lower temperature hot water system?
It's something we had considered, and where longer term it might be something we revisit, but because of the age of a lot of our estate, the buildings would require quite a significant amount of improvement if we were going to go to a lower temperature hot water system. So we wanted to get something that would deliver some reductions quickly, and at the moment that's still something we've not considered. Some of our buildings, smaller buildings that can be supplied, by air source heat pumps and things, we have replaced those, carried out building upgrades and installed air source heat pumps on them. But for the larger buildings that are fed by the existing steam system, it's not feasible at this point in time. If we were to get future funding through something like the PSDS or something, it could be a consideration, but at this time we just felt this was the best way to reduce our emissions and improve the efficiencies and performance of our network.
Great, thank you for answering that. Jack's asked, do we need to know how much something is going to cost before we apply for HNES, or do we apply for a specific element and HNES agrees to fund that element to a maximum cost?
I can take that one. As part of your, I guess capital and revenue applications, we do ask ideally for supporting quotations to demonstrate how you've come up with the funding amounts that you've come up with. Obviously, from our perspective, if we're awarding funding, we want to make sure that it is going to be claimed, and we want to make sure it's as realistic as possible, I guess. So ideally we would like you to have costed the works and come to us with sort of costed proposals. We do know that some applicants come to us before having done a procurement process, because I think particularly for heat networks with leaseholders and having to run Section 20 processes, it's they need to know whether they've secured funding or not before they go out to their leaseholders for consultation. So in some cases, people do run procurements afterwards, and obviously sometimes funding amounts can change. But we would like a degree of certainty, or sort of a degree of, at the time of application, this is how much we expect it to cost. And typically, like I say, that's based off of having gone out to market and just asking for quotes, so that we can justify the costs that are being put forward and whether or not we think they're reasonable within sort of market parameters. Do you want me to take the next one from David, Sasha?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
So this one says, Hull showed how once work starts, you can uncover all kind of nasty surprises and have cost overruns. is there any way in which DESNZ can help part fund the overruns, or is it wholly on the users of the network? From your stats, what percentage of capital projects have come in over budget? So taking the first part, again, obviously, we appreciate that projects don't always go as planned, and particularly if you're uncovering things like in the whole situation where you're looking at underground pipe work. We have projects as well where they build in contingency in case there's asbestos, things like that. So we do allow up to 10% contingency to be added to your grant request. So obviously, hopefully that can cover some of any potential overspend that may arise. But we do have some projects where, like I say, costs go over and above that, depending on the reason why it's going over budget. In some cases, the applicants themselves will cover the cost of that, and they don't come to us and ask for additional funding. In other cases, applicants do come to us and ask for additional funding, and we go through the project change process. Now, obviously, depending on how much funding is being requested, it comes down to sort of budgets in terms of what's available and what financial years you're requesting the funding to fall into. So it's not a guarantee that if you came to us and asked for more funding, that funding would be available. So going back to the application process, from our perspective, ideally the more certainty you can have in terms of application at that time as to how much you think it's going to cost, the better, because obviously if costs do spiral, there's no guarantee that the funding will be available, but there is a mechanism in place if costs do increase to review the funding award and determine whether or not additional funding can be provided. In terms of percentage of capital projects that are coming over budget, I don't have those figures to hand, and also a number of our projects are still ongoing, and they haven't completed yet. So it's not something I can answer right now, but we do have experience of some projects coming to us, or anecdotally telling us that the projects have come in more expensive than they were expecting.
Great. It looks like to be another question from David. This one's for Greg. So Southern mentioned that pre-CP1 builds can be problematic. What sort of issues have you found, and what do you advise us to look out for? They're 2010 to 2012 build, so I imagine that they'll have some common issues.
Of course. Well, I think it's important to recognize, what our skill sets are and, what yours may be. And for us, I don't think there's anything I could tell you that would be better than getting a specialist consultant in to have a look. The CP1 was really about getting, improving the standards across the sector in lots and lots of different ways. And those consultants who have a really detailed knowledge of CP1 and of heat networks will be able to give you the best advice. I mean, we look at it from a desktop point of view and from the output of our customers. And for our customers and for yours, it may be that their heat costs are higher, that there are more frequent breakdowns, their satisfaction is lower, or that there's things like overheating issues. I think if you've got those kind of end products, then that probably indicates that there's an issue. But I'd really recommend getting specialist input to diagnose what those issues are. Just looking at the age of the networks, 2010 to 2012, if they have HRUs, then it's likely that they'll be up for renewal relatively soon anyway. So there could even be some cost efficiencies there, dovetailing any works with the end of life of certain components. But submit a revenue application if available, or go down that route and get a consultant to have a look.
Brilliant. We also have another question from Stephen. It's a really long question, so we might want to get back to you on that, Stephen, unless you'd like to do a quick summary if you unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm happy to do a summary of what I've written. I thought by writing it might be easier to somebody to digest before answering, but it's fine. We are in the process of starting the build of a new network in central Manchester. Part of that network provides a significant amount of heat and private to a hospital site. What we have found in the initial design work and on-site excavations and so forth, and now into the detailed design stage, is that regardless of how much extra efficiency the new heat work will bring to the site, the secondary distribution systems, as we saw in the example from Hull University Hospital, may well leave some questions unanswered in terms of their ability to deliver the maximum efficiency that upgrading the overall network will do. Now, we understand the long time, the lead times involved in accessing these type of funds. Our own HNEP funding was originally secured in 2021. So we're fully aware of how long these things take. My question really is, if we are aware that further heat network efficiency or efficiencies will be possible by doing additional works on the secondary distribution system on behalf of the hospital, and also in the cooling system on behalf of the hospital, which we've already identified an opportunity to reduce their overall electricity consumption by between 4 and 5 gigawatts a year by doing that work. It's currently out of scope of our original project. It's likely to be in scope for a further stage in this project. But if we already know this information now, but we've not yet got an active operating heat network in the ground and serving heat to that site, at what stage can we start the application process for an efficiency project that we know already exists today and is going to be needed in the future?
Okay, I can probably take that one. So just to be clear, when you're talking about the secondary network, is that an existing heat network already that you're then connecting your HNEP funded projects to, or is that not currently connected to a heat network?
There is an existing heat network on the hospital sites. It is steam. So okay. The vast majority of it is steam and a very complex cooling solution as well, which is all really rather quite old. The objects of our network, of our solution rather, is to connect to the primary distribution points via the plant rooms on that site. In this particular example, there are 26 of them, and de-steam the site. So okay. In doing that, we're delivering a whole host of efficiencies already and a completely different solution to that which they've got today. And of course, we are de-steaming the site. But in the investigations that we've done in the 4 years now that we've been working on that site, we've seen an awful lot of other areas that are out of scope of the current build for that project that will at some point in the future need to be done. And the trust involved has asked us to consider whether we would be able to provide, as MEPL, we're Manchester Energy Partnership Limited, we would be able to provide those services. So in the same way that we've been able to gain support from HNEP to deliver this project at less than 50% construction funding, the expectation is that if we were built in the ground and delivering heat, that we would be eligible for HNES to make an application to try and assist further in those secondary systems. Mm-hmm. What I feel it's perhaps a little crazy to do is have to wait until we finish the project before we can make an application, which is probably going to take 2 years to deliver, when we could be running certain things in parallel. But my understanding at the moment is if you're not already operational, you can't apply.
So yeah, so HNES is only eligible for existing heat networks. So where you say in the there is already that steam heat network, if you were looking to make improvements to that existing heat network now, then we would be able to consider that. Any funding that you've received from HNEP or any other kind of government grants, so obviously the Green Heat Network Fund is out there. Someone mentioned PSDS earlier. We just need to make sure that there's no cross subsidy for that, so we wouldn't be able to fund the same works essentially through the two different schemes. However, if what you're saying is that you need to wait until your network that you're having funded through HNEP is operational for the savings on the existing heat network to make sense, then obviously that would be, you'd need to probably wait for that to be completed. But from an eligibility perspective, if you have an existing heat network that isn't operating efficiently now, then you can apply for HNES. But I would obviously explain about the situation with the HNEP funding and how that would then, how the two sort of networks would align together. Slightly tangentially to that, we have had application or inquiries from people who are looking to connect to a heat network and improve the efficiency of their building, but the building itself doesn't have a heat network. So in that case, that wouldn't be eligible because we're not improving an existing heat network. We would be improving the efficiency of a building to join to a heat network. So there's a difference there in terms of where there isn't actually an existing heat network. We can't fund works to join a heat network, for example, and obviously we can't fund building of new heat networks because that's what would fall under the Green Heat Network Fund. But if you have an existing heat network that needs improvement, then that is something we could fund. So it might be worth taking that one offline, Stephen, and having a separate chat on that in a bit more detail. But where you say you already have an existing secondary network, then potentially that would be eligible.
Yeah, thank you, Louise. I think it's confirmed what I was really asking the question about. But just for absolute clarification, I would very much appreciate the opportunity to take this offline with you or your colleagues. What we are building is ring-fenced within the funding that we've already received. And what we will build and deliver to those primary connection points on the sites of an existing heat network terminates our responsibility at this time at that point. Mm-hmm. But what we do know, because we've been all over the site now for quite some time, is that we believe we can make that ultimately through the delivery of our heat source to that site. They can make further efficiencies thereafter by improvements to their secondary distribution system, and by certainly, for example, using the return flow temperatures that will then be coming off our heat network to augment improvements to their cooling network and reduce their electricity consumption that they currently have at the moment, which is significantly high, to drive their cooling solutions. So they are a completely separate project. They're already identified, but because the primary contract to connect to the plant rooms is not yet finished or in operation, it would appear that we can't get ahead of the curve and make this application early.
I think it's probably best to take it offline because, like I say, we are able to accept applications just from secondary networks. So I think in this case it would just depend on the measures that you're looking to install and how the timing, I guess. But you don't have to. Within HNES, from an optimization perspective, we would ideally like the optimization studies to consider the whole network, from energy center through to dwellings, or sort of the end of the network if you don't have actual residents. But from a capital works perspective, you are able to submit applications just for, say, a secondary network rather than the full network, if particularly if there's a separate owner at the at the primary network stage, and then a potentially different owner on the secondary network. So we have received applications from secondary network operators, so that is possible. But yeah, it'd be useful to understand a bit more from you about how that's linking together, and whether it's suitable for an application. I'm not entirely clear at the moment whether it would or wouldn't be, depending on how that works. That will work through. But yeah, happy to take that offline.
Thank you very much. I'm guessing because I'm registered to this, you've got my email details somewhere.
Yes.
Please drop me a line. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I've just seen another question come in from Jack, saying, yeah, capital grants don't cover the primary source of heat generation, but would they cover a secondary heat generator? E.g., if we have a biomass that keeps going down, could we get a grant towards a backup gas boiler? So you're right, Jack. One of the exclusions under HNES funding is that we can't replace the primary heat source. In terms of backup, again, that we can fund temporary heat generation if, for example, you are the works you're looking to do would require a shutdown of the system in order to replace pipes or whatever. So in that sense, we can fund temporary heat generation, but we wouldn't be able to fund a backup gas boiler either, because that would ultimately be there for the long term, essentially. Even though it's a backup, it's still there, designed to be there for the long term. So we can fund temporary heat while the works are going on to improve the network, but we wouldn't be able to fund sort of long-term heat generation, I'm afraid. I believe that's all the questions in the chat so far. So I'll just give, oh, we've got another one just in from Tom. Whether a secondary heat network within a building that's connected to a larger district heat network, for example, building is connected to the Olympic Park, they are considered as a separate heat network. A building on the Olympic heat network wouldn't be expected to investigate the performance issues of the energy centre. Do you mean when you're doing a optimization study, Tom? Is it easier just to come off mute and sorry, I was just reading it as you sent it in. Ah, there you are. I can't hear you, but I can see you talking. No, sorry, can't hear you. Okay, I'll let me just read it again to see if I can understand. Secondary heat network within a building that's connecting to a larger heat network. They're considered a separate heat network. So if a building on the Olympic Park site was to submit an application for an optimization study, obviously the Olympic Park is a massive network, and different buildings on the site are run by different organizations. So yeah, we wouldn't necessarily expect an organization to go in and investigate another organization's heat network, basically, if they haven't got the responsibility for it. So it will be, unless there is an agreement with that organization, where if, for example, if you do have a primary and a secondary network led by two different, and they're sort of owned and operated by two different organizations, and they wanted to do an optimization study that covered both parts, you could have a lead applicant, and as long as there is written confirmation from the secondary network operator, for example, that they support the study covering their network as well, then it is possible for those two elements to be funded, even though there's two different network operators. But yeah, if on a secondary network, we wouldn't necessarily expect this optimization study to go outside of the scope of what the heat network operator is responsible for, basically. So particularly in those really large heat networks, then yeah, if they don't have responsibility or control over the energy center, and their responsibility only starts from the point at which they take the heat, then that's what we would expect the optimization study to cover and focus on, what is in their control, I guess, to address.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes, hello.
Sorry, okay. Okay, thanks. I think it'd just be good to get clarification on that, because those sort of campus type networks, you might have what we would consider 20 heat networks with a building heat network within the building. So 20 buildings, each with their own heat network, connecting down to a substation, which is then connecting to a much larger energy center distribution network. We would consider them as effectively 21 heat networks, because the issues in that building are going to be very distinct to that building up to the substation, and that the works that would go on in there, and the optimization study and the capital works in that building would not be related to how the CHP and boilers are all working in the energy centre, like a long railway that's delivering heat to the whole campus. It'd just be good to get some, because I think this is in relation to sort of Stephen's question. So it'd be good to get some kind of guidance on where that delineation is. Is it if an organisation, if it's the same organisation that's running the building in the network, they can't get to? Could they get one for one building and the network, but not other buildings?
It comes down a little bit to complexity, I guess. We have a optimization study guidance range in terms of cost of what we expect an optimization study to cover. So that's between 15 and 24,000 pounds, including that. So if an organisation, like I say, if there were certain elements within a secondary part of the network that they wanted to focus, that's where they knew the issues were, and that's where they wanted to focus their optimization study, then that would be allowed, as long as they justified in their application why they were not considering the rest of the network and why they just wanted to focus on that particular element. And if there were, like say in your example, 4 sort of secondary networks that obviously we're also aware of organizations where heat networks have started off as individual networks and then have been joined to a primary network. So they were originally designed as a standalone network and are then joined to a bigger network. So there might be similar examples of that on the one network, and actually the secondary networks themselves are very different and very standalone. So again, it would come down to, my recommendation would be to speak to one of us ahead of submitting any application, just so we can understand the complexities of the network and I guess the uniqueness of each of the secondary networks in this example, and for us to then say whether or not it makes sense to do a separate secondary network study, or actually the complexity isn't there and we feel that actually within the scope of the funding we would be questioning, well, why aren't you actually opening up that scope to look at everything within the network? So it's our starting point is that we would like the whole network to be reviewed, because obviously we want to make sure as many optimization measures are identified as possible. However, within that cost bracket and within the scope, if it's like I say, if it's different organizations, then that kind of, because obviously the funding goes to one organization, so that kind of sets a bit of a parameter as well. But if there is multiple buildings or multiple networks kind of within one network, then it is possible to submit different applications, provided we understand the rationale behind why that is the proposed approach. And a lot of that, I think, will come down to complexity of the networks that are being reviewed.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Fab. No worries. Okay, I think that's all the questions. Unless anyone has anything else they want to raise. I would say that we're hoping to do more of these webinars in the future, particularly as more of our funded projects complete their capital works in particular. Hopefully you found it useful to hear from some real life examples of the types of networks that we're funding and the kind of measures and improvements and challenges that have arisen. So if any of our funded projects are on the webinar and are getting near completion and would like to speak at some of these events in future, we'd really welcome hosting more of these, just because I think they're really interesting to hear about other people's experiences and hopefully for those that have heat networks that maybe haven't got HNES funding, or even those that do, maybe hearing about other challenges that people are experiencing or other improvements that people have made can give you food for thought as well. If you are interested in hearing more about the scheme, please follow us on our social media accounts. That's where we put out case studies, where we put out press releases, where we put out the next funding round dates, all that kind of stuff. So definitely give those a follow and join our mailing list as well if you want to keep up to date with how the scheme's progressing. But if there are no further questions, I'd just like to say thank you to our speakers, to Mark and to Greg and to Alex at the start. And yeah, hopefully you found the session interesting. And yeah, if you're interested in applying for round 9 for HNES funding, please get in touch. And thank you very much everyone for your time.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone. Bye.